Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK, and today we're playing 4 decks from Bloomburrow. First up is Matt playing Bria, Riptide Rogue. Matt's going to cast a bunch of cantrips and smash into his opponents for big damage. Scott is playing Flubs the Fool. It's a Teamer Lands Matter deck, so he's going to play lands. Next up, we have me playing Baylen, the Haymaker. My plan is to create all the tokens, and I'll use Baylen's abilities along the way. And we have Kyle playing Bello, Bard of the Brambles. He's going to turn his enchantments into indestructible hasty 4/4s and beat up his opponents. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Matt starts off strong with an island into a soul ring, into a talisman of creativity, and he uses that to pay for an opt, in that fancy Japanese art from Strixhaven. So he'll scry one, he puts that to the bottom and draws from it before passing the turn over to Scott. He draws for turn, and he plays a Flooded Strand as his land. Then he'll go to pass, cracking it, losing 1 life, and fetching up a Thundering Falls. When that ETBs, he'll surveil 1, and he pitches that to the bin. On to my turn, I draw, and I play a tapped Temple Garden and say go over to Kyle. I'm not in a rush. He draws, and then he plays a Fabled Passage as his land, and then he says go over to Matt. On his turn 2, he draws and plays a Mountain as his land, before casting his commander, Bria, Riptide Rogue. With that out onto the battlefield, he'll share some prowess with other creatures. On to Scott's turn 2, he plays a Stomping Ground, untapped at the cost of 2 life, and with that out, he'll play an Explore. This allows him to play an extra land and draws a card. So he does so, and then he plays a Scalding Tarn as his second land. And with that out, he'll pass the turn, and then crack that on my turn. So he goes and finds a Steam Vents, having it enter the battlefield tapped. And onto my turn, I play a Mountain as my land, and I cast Intangible Virtue. This will give my tokens +1/+1 and Vigilance, and I'm going to want that for sure. On my end step, Kyle cracks his Fabled Passage, and he goes and grabs a Forest. And then onto his turn proper, he'll draw his card and then play a Mountain as his land for turn, and he uses that in order to cast a Rampant Growth with that beautiful Lord of the Rings artwork. So he'll go and find a basic forest and have that enter the battlefield tapped. On to Matt's turn, he draws and plays a Fiery Islet as his land. He then casts a Reconnaissance Mission, triggering prowess on his commander, and enabled some card draw after he hits his opponents. Not bad. He then casts Pearl of Wisdom. Its cost is reduced, of course, and it triggers prowess on his commander once again. So he'll draw 2, and then he moves into the red zone, swinging at me for no good reason. I take my commander damage, and then his Reconnaissance Mission will trigger, drawing him an additional card. Afterwards, he passes, and on Scott's turn 3, he plays his commander, Flubs the Fool. He's so foolish. And with Flubs out on the battlefield, he plays a land. It's a Field of the Dead. This will trigger Flubs, forcing him to discard a card. And Flubs is also like, yo, you could play more lands. And so he does. It's a Training Center, entering the battlefield untapped, of course. He had to discard a card. Then he casts Ren's Resolve. This will have him exile the top 2 cards of his library, and he could play them until his next turn. And so into the exile zone goes an Aetherflux Reservoir and a land. But Scott has more to do in the form of a Gitaxian Probe by paying 2 life instead of that blue manas. This will have him look at my hand and draw a card from Flubs because he had 0 cards in hand, then draw a card from Gitaxian Probe. He passes the turn, finally, and on my turn I play a Plains as my land, and follow that up by casting a Cultivate. I'll get another Plains to my battlefield tapped, and a Forest into my hand before saying go over to Kyle. On Kyle's turn, he drops a Mountain, and then he casts his delightful Raccoon Bard, Bello, Bard of the Brambles. He follows that up by playing a Birds of Paradise, in that beautiful Lord of the Rings artwork once again. Then he casts Flare of Cultivation, and he does so by sacking that Bop. This will have him go grab 2 lands, 1 entering the battlefield tapped, and the other one going to his hand. He did accidentally leave that on the battlefield for right now, but it doesn't matter at all. On Matt's turn, he plays a Balmor, Battle Mage Captain, so that'll synergize nicely with his commander. He casts an Expedite, so both Balmor and Bria trigger. Matt will have Bria become unblockable, and he gets to draw a card. He then plays a City of Brass as his land for turn, and then moves into combat, swinging at Kyle with Bria and me with Balmor. That's hasty. So we take our beats. He gets to draw a couple cards thanks to his reconnaissance mission before casting Swiftfoot Boots. Afterwards, he goes ahead and equips his commander for that little bit of protection. And on to Scott's turn 4, he draws. Then he'll play a Valakut Exploration, so that could result in some impulsive card draw and possibly some damage to his opponents. When he cast it, Flubs triggered, so he had to pitch a card. Then he plays a Fabled Passage as his land, drawing a card from Flubs, and exiling a Mishra's Bauble thanks to his Valakut Exploration. He then casts Noxious Revival. He gets to draw from Flubs, and then he puts a Laboratory Maniac from his graveyard on top of his library. And while that doesn't do much good for him right now, he goes ahead and sacks his Fabled Passage in order to give a good shuffle and grab a land and put it onto the battlefield. And with that forest hitting the battlefield, Valakut Exploration triggers, so he'll exile a card.
I'm gonna play a Jessica's Will.
You're still doing things?
Yes!
And with Jessica's Will, he'll look at Matt's hand to generate 6 floating red manas and exile the top 3 cards of his library. In this case, they are all lands. So, got him. Following that, he uses 4 of that 6 floating red mana in order to cast his Aetherflux Reservoir from exile. As a follow-up, he casts for free the Mishra's Bauble from Valakut's exile. This will trigger his reservoir and gain him 5 whole life. It also triggered Flubs, so he gets to draw a card from that. He then plays Talon Gates of Madara. He'll have this temporarily phase out his Flubs, and Field of the Dead triggered to get him a 2/2 Zomboy. Afterwards, he'll move to his end step, so he'll clean up his exiled cards. Valakut Exploration deals 2 damage to each one of his opponents as well. He's playing an awful lot of Solitaire over there. And onto my turn, I drew, and I played a Forest before casting Smothering Tithe. You won't see cards like Smothering Tithe too often in our decks, but it makes sense in my token generation deck. I pass, Kyle draws, and then he annoyingly does pay the 2. He then drops Timber Crown Pathway before casting Greater Good. Hey, that's a 4/4 with haste and indestructible. He moves into combat and attacks Matt and Scott. They take their beats, and afterward Kyle gets to draw a card because that's what Bello says to do. In this case, he does not pay the 2, so I get a treasure. Yay! On Matt's turn, he draws and then he pays the 2. Then he moves into combat, swinging at both me and Scott, like a Rudy McBooty. As a follow-up, he gets to draw 2 cards thanks to Reconnaissance, and he pays the 2. Both times. Then he casts Young Pyromancer. Young Peasy. He moves into his end step, and Scott decides to sack his Mishra's Bubble, so he gets to draw a card on his upkeep, and he peeked to the top card of my library. He didn't pay the 2 for those 2 card draws, so I gain more treasures. He then casts Frantic Search. He says, Brandon, I'm not paying the 2 for any cards I draw this turn. And he proceeds to draw, and I make my treasures with a smile on my face. He gets to untap his 3 lands before casting 3 visits. So he'll go fetch up a forest card, and along the way, Flubs triggered, so he gets to draw a card because he is currently Heckbent. It was also the second card he played that turn, so he gained 2 more life thanks to Aetherflux Reservoir. So he throws that untapped forest out onto the battlefield, which will trigger his Valakut Exploration, exiling a Hedron Crab, which is pretty cool. Field of the Dead triggered, got him another 2/2 zombie. Then he plays Polluted Delta as a land. This will once again trigger Flubs, letting him draw a card, as well as Valakut Exploration, having him exile another card, and Field of the Dead once again, gets him a 2/2 zombie. He then plays his Hedron Crab, which allows him to gain some more life. He follows that up by playing Brain Freeze, targeting himself in order to mill 3 cards. He got a Lotus Cobra exiled thanks to Valakut Exploration, and he remained true to his promise of not paying for any of the treasures that I'll be making this turn, having drawn many cards. And I appreciate that about him. After all of his triggers, he resolves his Brain Freeze, having milled 3 cards. Then he casts the Lotus Cobra from exile. This will trigger Flubs once again, and Reservoir, so he gains some more life. After that, he decides to crack into his Polluted Delta at the low cost of 1 point of life. He'll go a-searching for a land, and sadly, my man fails to find. And we laugh at him for a good long while. He passes the turn, I draw and play a forest as my land. before casting a big martial coup. Looking around at the board state, I don't like the creatures out on the battlefield. So X equals 6. This will destroy all other creatures after I make 6 tokens. Kyle and Matt were doing a good job of keeping treasures out of my hands, but Scott let me have it all. As a follow-up, I play my commander, Baylen the Haymaker. I then use some of my treasure tokens for Baylen's first ability to cast a Birds of Paradise with a green mana. Then I pass the turn over to Kyle. He plays Outcaster Trailblazer. This thing might draw him some cards, and I'm totally fine with that. He then recasts his commander, Bello, Bard of the Brambles, making his enchantment a 4/4, which he moves into combat swinging at Scott because he's not going to make it through my tokens. So he deals damage, he gets to draw a card, and then I get to make a treasure. He passes the turn to Matt, who draws. Again, I make a treasure. Then he recasts his commander, Bria, Riptide Rogue, and he has to say go after that. On to Scott's turn, he draws, and then he recasts his commander, Flubs the Fool. Reservoir triggers, and then he decides he wants to be able to play more lands and casts Azusa, Lost but Seeking. So he gets to play 3 whole lands on his turn in addition to his normal land. What? He then passes, and on his end step, I activate Baylen by tapping all of my tokens. This will result in me activating Baylen's third ability 3 times, getting 9+1 counters. I play Battlefield Forge as my land, then I cast Agate Instigator with Offspring online, but is swiftly arcane denialed by Matt. And it makes sense, because he's worried about the tokens that I'll generate. And despite being upset at Matt, I decide to activate Baylen's third ability 2 more times, and then I swing into Scott. Scott is presenting a little bit more shenanigans that I have to deal with, so I decide to try to go after him first. Scott decides to throw Flubs in the way of my commander, but with the trample over the top, I still deal 17 whole damage. And I'm not mad about that. Afterwards, I play a Nature's Lore, and I'll go find a Jetmir's Garden and have that enter the battlefield tapped, of course. Following that, I pass the turn over to Kyle. He draws, doesn't pay the 2, so I get a treasure. Then he moves right into combat at Matt, hoping to draw a card. Matt decides to take the damage, allowing Kyle to draw. Kyle then plays an Argothian Enchantress, hoping to generate some more card draw whenever he's casting enchantments. He then casts Destiny Spinner, drawing from it, and making sure that his things can't be countered, which is pretty good. He then passes the turn to Matt, who plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and then he casts Coruscation Maid with Offspring as well. So every time he'll cast an instant or sorcery, he'll start pinging 2 points of damage to each of his opponents. He then re-equips Bria with Swiftfoot Boots, and then casts Crash Through. This, of course, triggers all 3 of his creatures, so he'll throw 2 points of damage to each one of us, and then each of his creatures gets Prowess triggered as well. Pretty good. He draws, thanks to Crash Through, and then casts Burgi, God of Storytelling, hoping to secure some of that mana generation to cantrip for all day long. Afterwards, he moves into combat, swinging his unblockable Bria at me, and I take the commander damage, dropping to 21. Reconnaissance mission triggers, drawing him a card and getting me a treasure. On Scott's turn, he draws, and then he plays a beautiful Growth Spiral in that Japanese artwork from Strixhaven. He draws a card and gets to put an additional land down onto the battlefield this turn. He then casts Strike It Rich from Flashback, generating a treasure token, triggering his things that needed triggering, and then passing to me. And on his end step, I tap down my tokens in order to draw 3 whole cards thanks to Baylen's ability. On my turn, I draw and play a Sacred Foundry, making sure it enters untapped at the low cost of 2 life. I cast an Impact Tremors, and hopefully that gives me enough reach to close out the game. Move into combat, swinging my commander at Matt and my tokens at Scott. And before blocks are declared, Matt decides to rapid hybridization my Baylen. Oh, that'll kill my commander dead, but hey, I get a frog lizard. Also, it should have triggered Impact Tremors, but I forgot. So they all have 1 additional point of life that they shouldn't have. Speaking of life, we all lost 2 when Matt cast rapid hybridization. After Scott took his beats, I recast my commander in my second main phase. I remember the Impact Tremors trigger there, and pass to Kyle. He plays a Cinderglade as his land for turn before casting Unnatural Growth. A great enchantment to have That's also a 4/4 indestructible hasty creature for this turn. And he gets a bunch of triggers, drawing cards, and then he moves into combat, swinging at Matt and Scott. They decide to both chump block by throwing creatures in front of those two 4/4s. Kyle then moves to his end step, and before Matt untaps, I want to cast my Secure the Wastes, where X equals 21. My Impact Tremors is going to do a bunch of work, and my tokens will clean up the mess. In response to that, Kyle casts Unholy Heat on my Baylen, trying to just do what damage he can. In response to that, activate Baylen's second ability, drawing a card at the cost of tapping my tokens. When Secure the Waste resolves, I deal 21 points of damage to each one of my opponents, thanks to Impact Tremors, knocking Matt and Scott out of the game. Then, onto my turn, I move right into the red zone, attacking Kyle with everything. He lines up some blocks for good measure, and before damage is dealt, he sacks all of those creatures to his greater good, drawing a bunch of cards, having to discard a little bit along the way, and hoping to find some sort of answer. He basically knows that he doesn't have a way out of this, but I mean, who doesn't love to draw a boat ton of cards before you die? And with that, his creatures are dead, my creatures connect with him, knocking Kyle out of the game, and making me the winner. Yay! And as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. But that's the game. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for watching.